first part is going to be about theoretical JavaScript, object-oriented concepts. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi. Hey. As he said, we're going to start off with a little bit of concepts and the differences basically between what we know about object-oriented programming and what JavaScript implements as object-oriented programming. And there's a big difference. So what I'm going to ask you now is to forget what you know about OOP, because we're not working with OOP right now. We're working with something called OO, which is unique for JavaScript. Some of you might know it as prototype object-oriented programming. We're going to start off with something very simple. Okay, so sorry. Okay, so the title of this section of the workshop is JavaScript OO, JS's version of OOP, but not quite, because it's not quite. What we know about OOP is a traditional OOP is based on class definitions that work as blueprints for the instantiated object. So basically, you have to map out the object, how it looks like, and then you create instances of that object. Whereas in JavaScript, it's different. In JavaScript, it's truly object-oriented because what we're working with is the object and not an initial blueprint that we later use to create objects. There's a difference between a JSON object and a string. The JSON object is a JavaScript object, whereas the JSON string is just a string, and it's a notation of what the object would be from in JavaScript. So basically, if you are to see an example of that, you see I have a small JavaScript that basically it's a couple of small functions, and we're going to see how they behave. Okay, so if you go to the console now, and go back to the code. Okay, so basically what the first function does is we're defining a string, and in that string there's a notation, and that's the JavaScript object notation. Everyone's familiar with that, but we need to differentiate between the string and the object. So first of all, the way we parse strings differs. The original way was using the evaluate function in JavaScript. And what we do is write an immediately invoked function and then concatenate the JSON string in that function so it becomes an object. What it returns to this is an actual object. Whereas we can also use JSON.parse, which is better because it does the integrity checks that it does for whatever it needs to do. Okay, so if we run the main function for this, okay, so أول شيء رح أحكي شوي بالعربي لأنه I guess it's better and they asked me to do that. So anyway, the first object that we spit on the console, object 1, which we used the eval to return the JSON string from, we got the object as seen here as an object, not a string. It's not a string anymore, it's an object. Same goes for the JSON.parse. Okay, now if we go to the second function, this is purely to talk about the notation of objects in JavaScript. So first of all, we have two objects, object 1 and object 2. In object 1, we defined A and B as members of that object, and we gave them a value of 1 and 2. And in object 2, we defined C and D, but as strings, unlike in object 1. And then what we did is a bunch of console.logs on object1.a then object 1 of B, that's like array notation. It's not object notation. And the same for object 2. What we see is that it doesn't matter if we used object notation or array notation, we're still going to get the same results. We're still going to access that property of that object. Now let's make it a bit more complicated. What we have here is a constructor object, a constructor function, I'm sorry. The constructor function's job is to build an object and then return that object to the developer. So basically what we do here is we just create the object and then return this, which would be the object, all right? I'm using this to show you differences between, or how we can create private members, setters and getters, public members, public, private, and privileged methods, and we'll see what these are about. So first of all, we have a private member. We define that with a var before it. And then we have a public member. We define that by using this dot, whatever we want, equal whatever we want, because we know how flexible JavaScript is. Here we have a setter for name and a getter for name. These are both privileged methods. By privileged, we mean they're public. They're just not public for every object that's copied from that object, and we'll see the difference later on. And we have a private method, which cannot be called from outside the scope of this function. The same goes for the private member. This private function can only be called inside, and we're using that private function in one of our privileged or public functions, right? Then we go into something called a prototype. When we create a prototype for a JavaScript object, what we're doing is we're telling the interpreter that whatever object that belongs to that class or is a copy of that object or is constructed using that constructor function will have a function called increment age. And that function will increment the age, obviously. So it doesn't matter how many instances of JSON object example 2 we create, we're always going to have the increment age function. Now, what we did here is, first of all, we created an object using the new operator for the constructor function. We passed on some arguments with our name and age. And then we used console.log to show that this object does not have a property of underscore name, and it does not have a property of underscore print or method of underscore print. And as we see from the results here, it's false and false, because these are private methods and private members that we cannot access. And later on, we called increment age, which increments the age, which we've written in the prototype of that object. And from 26, it spit out 27. And then we assigned 100 for the age, and then we print it again, and there we are. Okay, so basically what we're trying to accomplish here is trying to understand how the objects in JavaScript work at the very basic level. So we have the private members, the public members, we have the private, privileged, and public methods. Now, okay, so let's talk a bit about functions. We all know that JavaScript is a functional language, and by functional language we mean it's a language in which we can use functions as variables. Actually, in JavaScript, functions are actual objects. So the way we can see that, the way we can actually prove that, is by doing this. Okay, let's go back to the code. Okay, so here we have a couple of functions that we're using. The first one is the out function. All it does, it uses console.log to print the value and then returns true. It's nothing special, it's just a function. In the second function, it's an addition function. But this addition function takes a value, value 1, another value, value 2, and then obviously it adds the values. That's why it's called addition. And then we have an output channel. Now the output channel could be console.log, or as far as we know, it could be maybe a JAX callback to the server. So what we did here is, in TCM2 main, first of all, we create a new variable called print. And as you can see, all we did was assign to print out. Now out is a function, but when written without parentheses, what we're doing is we're just assigning this function to this variable. So basically, a function is being treated as a variable. It's being treated as an object in JavaScript. In the second line of code, what we did, it's a variable. I kind of predicted it's going to be Boolean because out returns true. And then I called out with a string, which causes out to print test on the console. Now, test and then print true because we're printing, we call print here. Do you notice that? We didn't call out, we called print, which calls out. So later what we did was call addition. We gave it values 1 and 2. It will probably yield 3 because it's addition. And then we passed on print. And what it did was it print out 3. And in the second line of code, what we did was we added 3 and 4, and then now we passed out. But the same thing happened because it's the same function. In the third example, what we did was, instead of using a function, we wrote a function, like right there as a parameter. And we passed it on, and it did the same thing. What that function does is actually called print again, which calls out, which prints on the console. Now, in the third example, what we did was we passed 3 integers. Now, the last parameter, the third parameter of that function should be a function because we're using that function to call, right? But what we do here is it's a kind of a check. In addition, what we did was type of output channel, which is the third parameter. If that type of is equal to function, then we run it. Otherwise, we print out that the output channel is invalid and that we used console.log instead. So here you can see how much we can play with functions because they're basically variables and they're actually objects also. So they're pretty flexible for our use. Now, in the last example, I'm going to talk a little bit about the object constructors and anonymous functions. So up here, I created a constructor function, underscore object. It takes 3 values, whatever the values are. And it passes it on to the object, builds the object using these values, and then it returns the object itself. So what we did here is we create a new instance of underscore object. First of all, we gave it 1 as the first value. Then we gave it a string for the second value. And then what we did, we passed a function right here. And it's an anonymous function, and we passed it as a parameter. What it did is it stored it in value 3, and then we simply just called value 3 as though we're calling any other function. And that would print out the object. So as you can see, in JavaScript, functions are very flexible. We have to treat them as objects, and we have to understand that even as a functional language, it doesn't quite follow the other rules of functional programming because it's JavaScript. We have to remember it's a script. It's being interpreted. It's meant to be that flexible, but it wasn't supposed to be that powerful up until a couple of years ago. So let's talk a bit about object constructors. We already saw 2 object constructors. So in JavaScript, we use functions to create new objects and call them object constructors and or constructor functions. Not constructor alone, that is something else. It's a bit different. It's basically the same thing, but in constructor, it's not the actual function. It's the same as print was for out. It's just a reference for the function. So we also can have namespaces in JavaScript. And when I say objects and namespaces, and as I said at first, we need to forget the original, the typical object-oriented that we know and how to work with. For example, C++. Everyone learned probably object-oriented programming either on C++ or on Java, but it's quite different here. So building namespaces is just like creating other objects. So you can put an object inside another object, and that object is now a namespace. And you can put multiple objects in one object, and that object would be a namespace. Okay, so first of all, this is another notation to create a new object, but it's an empty object. So we created a new object and we called it people. Now, this object we're going to use as a sort of a namespace for what we're going to do next. So next, people.person. It's equal to function. It takes an ID, name, age, and profession. And then it builds an object with a function, with a method print, and then it returns that object to us. We also added on the person prototype, people.person.prototype.change_name, a function that would change the name of that person or that object. And then we simply instantiated a new object. We print the value of the object. And then we changed the name, and then we print it again. And what we get is two objects. And they're the same object, but the name is different because we use that function. Right? Now, بدنا شوي نلعب فيها. Okay, so Jad is that variable, and I didn't create it using var, so it's a global variable. That's why I can access it from the console. So if we are to delete this and then call Jad dot what do you think will happen now? Any ideas? So object, which is Jad in this case, has no method change name because we removed that from the prototype of person. So now we can see we have a namespace, we have how to build prototypes, how they behave, and we have object, a new object, which is person, that we can instantiate using the people.person function, new people.person. That's as far as namespaces go. So, now, what are closures? If you remember the first slide, we had an eval that calls immediately invoked function that returns the JSON string, which is in turn an object. So this is what the closure is. The closure basically is a function within a function, or it's a function that is immediately invoked. There are different usages for closures, but mostly okay. Okay, so we're going to skip the code for that part because we've already seen it. I'm going to jump straight ahead for the juicy parts. I'm sure everyone's thinking about inheritance and prototypes. Okay, so prototyping. Remember how we said earlier that JS objects don't have a class, blueprint, they belong to? Well, this isn't entirely correct. Prototypes are exactly that. They're kind of blueprints. So prototype help us maintain a steady and integrityful objects in our code. Also used in one form of inheritance in JavaScript. There are multiple forms of inheritance in JavaScript, and we'll be discussing every one of them. That's why I'm trying to be quick here, because it's going to take a lot of time. And inheritance. Inheritance in JavaScript OO can be considered tricky. In fact, it is not. But the problem is we don't think the same way. What we think about is a class which we use to instantiate an object. That is not the case here. What we have here is objects that are copying themselves. And they have a blueprint. It's called a prototype. So let's talk about inheritance. What I did here is I wrote over 8 ways in which we can use inheritance in JavaScript. Each way is different. Some of them are similar. For example, this one is a simple copy. What we did is we just copy properties from one object into another object. But that object is not an instance of the initial one. It's just a copy. And in the other one, we create a new instance of that object in the prototype. In another one, we just throw the constructor function in the prototype. There are different ways to use inheritance in JavaScript. And looking at the code we have here, so first of all, there's a child object 1, and then we call function inherit to so that child object 1 can inherit from object 1, which is it's just a regular constructor function that returns the object after filling in the properties. So what we got was option 1. What we got was an object, and there's an object in the prototype, and there's function inherit, but it means nothing. It does nothing, because what we did here is just we tried to copy these into the prototype, and that doesn't work in this case. It might work in object case because this object, object 2, because this object 2 is a function, whereas object 1 is just the object. So if we replace object 1 here with object 2, then we run the code again. What we got here was a function in the prototype of that object. So we still didn't quite get the inheritance, right? Because we don't have the basis of what that object is made of, and we can't copy it to the other object. So we go to the second option, which is option 2, which in this case is simply we just throw the prototype of the second object inside the prototype of the first object. That also doesn't work in both kinds of objects. The third option, that is also an empty object, which means it didn't work, is that we tried to create a new instance in the parent prototype and then create an instance of that parent prototype and assign it to the prototype of the child function. What we did basically is the same as here, but we just added an extra layer in there, and it did nothing for us because we still got nothing. Now, the fourth method to use inheritance, what we did is we just copied the properties from one object to the other. So what we're doing is we're copying properties. It's not even inheritance, but when you're working on an object level, it might come in handy. So as you can see, we got all the values here. In option 5, what we did is something called prototypal inheritance. This is where we actually take the constructor function and then store it in the prototype of another object, a middleware, as I bet now. And then we return a new instance of that object. That is good because the object that is yielded from this merger is both an instance of the child and an instance of the parent, and we can know that by using instance of. And in JavaScript, there's like type of, there's instance of. So if you use two objects, if object one is instance of object two, which means they had the same, they inherit from each other. Now, the sixth way we use it. We're going to repeat that because that's يعني حنرجع على هيدي النقطة، حنرجع على function كتير قريبة لإلها ونفهمها أكتر. هول عم بقطع فيهم بسرعة just examples. So the sixth way is just creating a new instance inside the prototype, and that also doesn't work. The seventh way, which is kind of close to the fifth, but instead, no, actually it's the same, I'm sorry. And then we have the inherit. In inherit, what we did was we ran a test to see if the object being passed here is actually a constructor function or an object, because مثل ما شفنا قبل في عنا object 1, object 2, واحد منهم object, الثاني is a constructor function. So as a can function, it creates a new one and then puts it in the prototype. Or as a can object, it just throws it in the prototype and then returns a new instance of that. Okay? So جواب على سؤالك اللي كنت عم تسألني إياه قبل إنه ليه في parent بالنص؟ لأنه بدنا نوصل لهيدي النتيجة. والنتيجة هي إنه شو ما قطعنا kind of object هون إذا constructor function أو an object, a JSON object, it will still inherit from it. لأنه عم نخلق هيدا إذا بدك ال object in the middle. Okay, that basically interprets شو بيصير هون. يعني هيدا ال object يلي it has an empty constructor. What we're doing is عم نكب ال prototype تبعه أو a new instance of the constructor function أو the object, the JSON object itself into the prototype, and then returning a new instance of that. So اللي بيصير عنا هون إنه it uses the prototype to create a new object. So when you have the new, لازم كنت تقولها بالأول هيدا. وقت يكون في new basically بعمر الأوبجكت من شو حاطين له نحن بالconstructor function plus شو محطوط بالprototype وبرد لنا الأوبجكت. Alright?
The problem I can see with this, each time you need to create a child object, you need to have the parent object at hand. And this defeats the purpose of inheritance.
اوكي ما برجع بعد لك شو قلت اول شيء اول ما بلش انه بدك تشيل من راسك شو بتعرف عن inheritance عن polymorphism عن كل شيء object oriented لانه working with objects in JavaScript is totally different and it's even for different purposes. يعني اذا بدك تشتغل objects in JavaScript كل شيء اللي فيك تعمله انه you can serialize your objects on the server and then send them as JSON تشتغل فيهم. But what we're doing here is a bit different. Using objects in JavaScript is for different purposes. يعني إذا شيء بدك تغير ال paradigm of the way you think, especially when it comes to that. What basically you have that in every language. When you're writing in one language and the other day you're writing in another language, بتضيع شوي لأنه مش بس syntax في logic بالده. The logic of how the language operates بيتغير. So JavaScript is so drastic that a lot of people call it it's a shitty language. A lot of people like love it. And the thing is, we need to understand, no, it's not a typical language. We're not supposed to treat it as a typical language. We're not supposed to write typical code. It's supposed to be hack code. That's the whole point of it. So, still, حتى الpoint يلي قلتها أنت هلا is still going to get clearer. بس نوصل على إذا بدك a defined model of inheritance or how to actually inherit in JavaScript. Okay, so using the last inherit. يلي هي basically it's the most إذا بتلاحظ هون مسميها the most sane and logical option. لأنه it is sane, it is logical, بضل عنا instance of, okay, and we can also use polymorphism. ليش؟ لأنه هون اللي عملناه إنه أول شيء child 1 inherits from object 1 and child 2 inherits from object 2, and then we printed both objects يلي فينا نشوفهم هون. Okay? And then حطينا child2.g, which is a prototype of object 2 only. It's not even an object 1. All right? And child2.g equal to 90, and then we print it out. And then we called child1.c, we gave it actually a function. Now child1.c already defined فوق. It's already a function. لأنه it inherits from an object that has a property called c and it's a function. So we did here, we عملنا override للfunction. So أول شيء بنعمله بنعيط ل this dot underscore proto. رح أرجع أحكي عنها هيدي بعدين. Let's skip it for now. But we use that to call the base class طبعا. And then dot c to call the original function. Okay? And then we do whatever we want to do in this function here. نفس الشيء goes for child2 يلي عملناه هون but without calling the parent. So إذا بنطلع على الأوتبوت تبعنا اوكي في عنا hello world اللي هي أول function فوق بعدين في test يلي كنت زايدينها نحن بسي بعدين child2.c is just spitting out test2. Now when we delete both these نرجع على hello world يلي هي موجودة بالبروتوتايب فوق اللي هي originally هيدي الفانكشن. alright حدا عنده أسئلة؟ okay. So basically what we did here is a form of polymorphism. قدرنا نعيط للبيس function قدرنا نكتب function function child object that overrides the base function وبعدين قدرنا نعمل delete لهالfunction whenever we want لحتى نرجع when we call child1.c it calls the original function that spits out hello world. Okay? Okay. So خلينا نجي لهون شوي. Okay, so هون we tried to simplify it. قبل كانت كتير معجقة، كان في كذا نوع inheritance، كان في كذا نوع شغلة. So let's simplify it شوي أكتر. We have two objects. We have an object A and we have an object B. All right? And we need to have a way to inherit, but that way has to be clear. And ما مفروض يكون في كتير spaghetti code. ما مفروض يكون في كتير like we don't have to close a lot of holes من وراها. منا مضطرين. لازم يكون في طريقة جالسة نقدر نعمل inheritance in JavaScript. So what we did here is we used the object.create. Okay? Object.create, it copies whatever you give it. So هون بنعطيها البروتوتايب تبع A وبنعطيها whatever values بدنا نعبي ب B. And when we create a new object of B, it inherits all the properties from A and then its own properties. But that's not enough. And that's not enough to set the values تبع properties اللي موجودين ب A بس مش موجودين ب B. So what we need to do is we need to call A dot call on this. حدا بيعرفها هيدي أو حدا ما بيعرفها تفسرها؟ الدوت call. Okay, so dot call هي basically رح أفسرها على حالتين. Dot call basically is when we want to call a function بس مش على الأوبجكت اللي هي بالسكوب تبعه لأنه دايما in JavaScript في scopes utmost scope being in the browser هو الwindow أو document تحته. So وقت نجي نقول call this function on this object اللي هو object B, what we're doing is we're running this, whatever we have in this function, we're running on this object. So a.call, what we're doing is we're calling the constructor function of the base class on this, for this object, with the values اللي بدنا نحطهم. بعدها تقيلة، بعدها منا كتير هينة to inherit in JavaScript, بس أكيد في طريقة أنظف. Okay. أول شيء بتعرفوا إن JavaScript already في عنا شيء اسمه object. What we did here was extend object. When we extend an object بنزيد شيء على البروتوتايب تبعه. So هون بدنا كل الobjects بالJavaScript اللي بدنا نستعملهم يعني بدنا نخلقهم نحن يكون عندهم these functions. بما إنه كل الobjects by definition they inherit from object in JavaScript. فينا نزيد whatever we want على البروتوتايب تبعه ونستعمله على object itself. So what we did here, we added a inherit function, and the inherit function uses the original, actually آخر inherit function وصلنا لأنه it's the cleanest form, which is what it does is أول شيء نعمل هيدا parent object يلي بنحطه بالنص نخلق instance منه, and then we assign الobject parent object اللي عم نقطعه للبروتوتايب تبعه, نرجع بنعمل new. هلا هيدي الكونستراكتور usually بدنا نقول له لبي انه يضل الكونستراكتور تبعه بي even if it inherits from A. هيدا it's another weakness بالجافا سكريبت, بس we can go on without it, ما لنا هالقد شيء كثير مهم. بعدين في عنا object constructor for A. What it does is بتاخد input, هيدا input is an object, and then it spits out input.a into the value of A. Then a.prototype.constructor, well A we're just defining a constructor تبع A بالprototype تبعه, and then we added our prototype command do something function, which is it's a printout there I did from A. Okay, so plus الvalue تبع A. بعدين في عنا object B. constructor function تبع object B is أول شغلة object.inherit from A, as you can see here, and we threw it inside the b.prototype. Then بالconstructor function عم نعيط ل this.base constructor A, input يلي هن الvalue. This.base constructor is another prototype زدناها على object فوق. Okay, and what it does, it calls the base constructor of the object على object itself, which نتفادى المشكلة اللي كنا فيها قبل, نعيط للfunction .call this, so هي بتعملنا إياها. Okay, another function زدنا على prototype هي base. Okay, رح نحكي شوي عن underscore proto. When you want to access the مش parent class, the prototype تبع any object in JavaScript, we use the underscore proto. Okay, هلا إذا بدي ألقط البيس كلاس تبع inherited object وعم بستعمل prototype inheritance, so لازم أعمله هو إنه روح على البروتوتايب تبع هذا object, which is what I did here. بس هون السؤال إنه ليه في مرتين underscore proto؟ الجواب له هيدا هو لأنه عم بضطر هون أخلق object بالنص. So basically proto is this empty parent, but the prototype تبعه is the parent تبع my class يلي هو B. So when I call an object B dot base, what it does, it returns A يلي هو actual base تبع object B. ايه
Guys, مين بده بيرة؟
أنا بيطلع لي. Okay, so بدي أكمل في عنا. Thanks. Cheers. Okay, so object C كمان it inherits from B مثل ما شايفين هون. I reassign constructor تبعها لها لحتى ما يصير constructor تبعها هو constructor تبع B. Okay, وبعدين بعيد this.base constructor B input اللي هو كمان value. Alright. نفس الشيء عم نازل فيها كتير, يعني إذا بتلاحظوا كل واحدة منهم في عندها a function do something that does something totally else. يعني A I did from A and then prints out this.A. B I did from B and then prints out A and B. C prints out A, B and C, etc. etc. Okay, whereas D has do something else. It doesn't have do something. ما عندها function do something D. It inherits from C, which inherits from B, which inherits from A, which means كلهم عندهم do something function. وهلا بنعرف بس نعيط ل do something على D شو بيصير معنا. So تحت we defined 4 objects اللي هن Z, Y, X and W. Z is of type A, Y is of type B, X is of type C and W is of type D. So هلا we're going to خلينا نبلش in Z. Okay, so Z is an object فيها it's of type A. Alright. فيها a property A, الvalue تبعها 1 وفيها function do something. ورح تلاحظوا كمان انه فيها inherit, base و base constructor, which is زدناهم نحن على البروتوتايب تبعها type object. So every object حيضل عنده اياهم هول. إذا بنقول Z dot do something obviously حيبعث لنا حيعيط الفانكشن اللي موجوده بكلاس A يلي هي I did from A والفاليو تبعها A. هلا اذا we go to Y, okay, Y is of type B. Alright, obviously we didn't define A in B لأنه A is defined in A and B is only defined in B. ما في شيء in B بيحكي عن A بس B inherits from object A, which means B حيكون عنده properties تبع object A. كمان إذا بقول له Y dot do something I did from B to 1. هلا إذا بقول له Y dot base شو مفروض يطلع لي هون؟ اوكي سو ردلي انتبهوا this is an empty object هيدي موجوده بالبروتوتايب منه مليان ما في A فيها اوكي it's just a blueprint of what B is built on. Alright, so what we have in the base is a blueprint of what B is built on. By the way, it can be treated as an object itself. يعني في له y.base.a بطلع لي null لأنه الفاليو تبعها null. إذا بحط لها equal 3. Alright, so صرت عم بحط values بالبروتوتايب تبع الأوبجكت كمان. تشوفوا قد إيه JavaScript is very flexible. That's why it's not منه غلط الطريقة بنشتغل فيها بس JavaScript تعطيك الأوبشن تشتغل ب whatever way. They're just a most optimal way to use it. أكيد البيس تبع y is a إذا بنعيط ل y dot do something كمان بقلنا it does something from b and then prints out a and b. هلا a in object b in y I mean هون is assigned to مش مثل z where it's assigned 1 so that's why بال output هون بنشوف إنه a is 2 and b is 1. The same goes for x. X is an object of type C. Obviously, the base تبع X is B. Okay, كمان it's an object that we stored in the prototype تبع C and it works as a blueprint of the object C. إذا بنقول له X dot do something there I did from C 3 to 1 which are the values of A, B and C. Alright? Now W is the object D كمان بأنه D it inherits from C وهيدا it comes naturally now صارت إنه البيس تبعها حيكون C. Alright? هلا إذا بقول له D dot do something sorry W dot شو صار هون؟ عيطنا لفانكشن اشعين او بدكم علي؟ اوكي اللي صار هون انه اذا بتتذكروا اوبجكت دي ما اعطيناه فانكشن do something سو وقت نعيط ل w.do something ما بعيط لشو عنده هو لانه do something ما أنا property عنده بس it is a property in the base class in the class that D inherits from so بعيط لهيدي so مشان هيك بما انه البيس تبع object اللي اسمه W هون which is of type D البيس تبعه is C so when we call w.do something بقلنا I did from C and then prints out only A, B and C لأنه بالنسبة ل C ما في D أصلاً بالفانكشن اللي مكتوبة ب C we're not printing out D إذا بنقول له do something else اللي هي ما خاصة بالباقي okay there I did something else from D 4 3 2 1 إذا بجي أنا بعمل هيك اوكي اذا هلا بعيط لاكس
It's still of type C. بس الفرق انه هلا
بطل عنده do something. So لما اقول له x dot do something لاحظوا هون عمل delete سوري هون عمل delete do something من البروتوتايب تبع type C. alright so لما اجي هون اقول له x dot do something انتبهوا بعده عنده اياها. اوكي بس اللي صار هون انه اي وحده عيط للبيس كلاس تبعه اللي هو بي. Okay, so it's the same case صار بسي هلا مثل ما عنا بدي. It has to do with the way prototypes work. بدي ارسم شغله هون. Alright, so basically اعتبروا عنا 4 objects مثل هون عنا A, B, C and D. Okay? وكل وحدة عندها prototype. اوكي هلا دي عندها بروتوتايب البروتوتايب تبعها في سي بس عندها a function itself كمان اللي هي do something. So when we call on d dot do something اوكي اول شيء بيطلع باوبجكت دي. اذا ما عنده do something function بيطلع بالبروتوتايب تبع اوبجكت بي اوبجكت دي. اوكي بعدين بس يطلع بالبروتوتايب تبع اوبجكت دي وما يلاقي كمان a function do something what it does is jumps up to the base class طب يلي هو سي. alright بس ما بيطلع باوبجكت سي بيطلع بالبروتوتايب تبع سي. يعني اذا بسي بالconstructor function تبع سي we define do something it's a privileged method it's not a public method that's why it's not inherited. okay so هلا عرفنا الفرق بين privileged methods و public methods. public methods بنحطهم بالبروتوتايبس بس نعمل inheritance بينزلوا على الchild class whereas هونيك لا بطي فينا نستعمل polymorphism اذا بنستعمل privileged methods. So that's why هون بيطلع على بروتوتايب. كمان بالبروتوتايب ما لقى بيطلع على بروتوتايب تبع بي ما لقى على بروتوتايب تبع A ما لقى لوين بيطلع بيرجع. يلي هو object. بروتوتايب تبع object. اوكي سو اذا بنحط object dot prototype dot do something نعطيه function do something بصير كل الاوبجكتس عندنا بالسكوب تبعنا اكيد عندهم this function. right خلصت. Okay, questions?
Before the question, guys, all the code is on GitHub. Can you show them your profile? Yes. So if you want to check the code, just go on GitHub. مين عنده GitHub account? Awesome. Okay.
Okay,
If you don't have one, please, you should do one because it's good.
All right, thank you. عندك سؤال؟ قل لي. ايه. Use what?
This.
أكيد. أكيد. شو قصدك in this way؟ انتبه ما فيك مش بتكتب هيك شيء لا تكتب هيك شيء، بتكتب هيك شيء إذا وصلت لمرحلة في حاجة أكيد. أو namespace JS مثلا ليه؟ This is native. This is very simple. ما في شيء ما عم تتلبك بشيء أنت. namespace JS تعرف كيف تستعمله؟ Have you ever used it? Basically إذا بتفوت تشوف الكود تبعه that's what they're doing in the same thing. ما فيها الفرق. هيك بيخلقوا namespaces هيك بيعملوا inheritance هيك بيعملوا polymorphism نفس الشيء. بس الفرق إنه هون it's native. إنه بس لحتى نفسرها تنفهم كيف تشتغل. هلا أكيد أنت بتقلي مثلا I'd rather use namespace JS بقول لك أوكي أكيد. مش هاجي أنا مثلا أعمل ويب سايت اليوم بدون ما أستعمل jQuery. ليه؟ تكتبهم كلهم أنا شو عم برجع أخترع الدولاب؟ لا بس بدنا نفهم كيف يشتغل. هي بعد أغمق من هيك يعني. أغمق بكتير من هيك. This is just the surface. بس if you go to my GitHub page there's 2 libraries that I've built. واحدة منهم مش library it's just experimenting with algorithms. You can check it out. اسمها JSML. وتاني واحدة is called _3. _3 is just pure experimental JavaScript. Like I just went apeshit on the على JavaScript. عرفت كيف؟ So you go check them out بتشوف إنه basically ثلاث أرباع القصص فيك تعملهم بالجافاسكريبت اليوم are experimental. بس ما ننسى إنه نود جي اس بلش من experimental. نود جي اس يوم أكل العالم. Right, so JavaScript is very powerful. بخوف قد إيه powerful. وجافاسكريبت أكيد ما هو أصلا it was built عليه. بس اليوم جافا سكريبت اذا بتشوف كيف ليه عم بيقوى الجافا سكريبت ليه عم بيصير it's becoming more prominent it's because our machines are becoming faster. جافا سكريبت has been the same language من اول ما اختاروها لهلا انه اوكي مغيرين كم شغله فيها بس انه it's the same language الاركيتكتشر تبعها هي ذاتها. لا ما تعتلم as long as مشكوك بيمشي الحال. شو بدك؟
desktop yeah can you paste to the folder هذا شات. Yes.
Any other questions?
عندي كل هالimportance of جافا سكريبت يعني هي تشبه مثلا other languages تعتمد على الحاجة
JavaScript has the syntax تبع شيء قريب ل C++ وجافا اكثر C++ من جافا مزبوط بس هذا ما له علاقه انه انت فيك تحكي فيك تستعمل الانجلش letters to write Spanish مثلا او to write different languages صح ما خلص syntax is something بس اللوجيك كل paradigm كل language عندها paradigm كل paradigm is based on a way of thinking و JavaScript is just different بس هي anything else thanks a lot
Thank you man. So